Part 6 of Oroonoko. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Oroonoko, or the Royal Slave, by Aphra Behn. Part 6. The gentleman that bought him was a young Cornish gentleman, whose name was Trefry, a man of great wit and fine learning, and was carried into those parts by the Lord Governor to manage all his affairs. He, reflecting on the last words of Oroonoko to the captain, and beholding the richness of his vest, no sooner came into the boat but he fixed his eyes on him, and finding something so extraordinary in his face, his shape and mien, a greatness of look and haughtiness in his air, and finding he spoke English, had a great mind to be inquiring into his quality and fortune, which, though Oroonoko endeavoured to hide, by only confessing he was above the rank of common slaves, Trefry soon found he was yet something greater than he confessed, and from that moment began to conceive so vast an esteem for him that he ever after loved him as his dearest brother, and shewed him all the civilities due so great a man. Trefry was a very good mathematician and a linguist, could speak French and Spanish, and in the 3 days they remained in the boat, for so long were they going from the ship to the plantation, he entertained Oroonoko so agreeably with his art and discourse that he was no less pleased with Trefry than he was with the prince, and he thought himself at least fortunate in this, that since he was a slave, as long as he would suffer himself to remain so, he had a man of so excellent wit and parts for a master. So that before they had finished their voyage up the river, he made no scruple of declaring to Trefry all his fortunes, and most part of what I have here related, and put himself wholly into the hands of his new friend, whom he found resenting all the injuries were done him, and was charmed with all the greatnesses of his actions, which were recited with that modesty and delicate sense as wholly vanquished him, and subdued him to his interest. And he promised him on his word and honour he would find the means to reconduct him to his own country again, assuring him he had a perfect abhorrence of so dishonourable an action, and that he would sooner have died than have been the author of such a perfidy. He found the prince was very much concerned to know what became of his friends, and how they took their slavery, and Trefry promised to take care about the inquiring after their condition, and that he should have an account of them. Though, as Oroonoko afterwards said, he had little reason to credit the words of a Baccharai, yet he knew not why, but he saw a kind of sincerity and awful truth in the face of Trefry. He saw an honesty in his eyes, and he found him wise and witty enough to understand honour. For it was one of his maxims, a man of wit could not be a knave or villain. In their passage up the river they put in at several houses for refreshment, and ever when they landed numbers of people would flock to behold this man, not but their eyes were daily entertained with the sights of slaves, but the fame of Oroonoko was gone before him, and all people were in admiration of his beauty. Besides, he had a rich habit on, in which he was taken, so different from the rest, and which the captain could not strip him of, because he was forced to surprise his person in the minute he sold him. When he found his habit made him liable, as he thought, to be gazed at the more, he begged Trefry to give him something more befitting a slave, which he did, and took off his robes. Nevertheless he shone through all, and his ozenbrigs, a sort of brown holland suit he had on, could not conceal the graces of his looks and mien, and he had no less admirers than when he had his dazzling habit on. The royal youth appeared in spite of the slave, and people could not help treating him after a different manner, without designing it. As soon as they approached him, they venerated and esteemed him. His eyes insensibly commanded respect, and his behaviour insinuated it into every soul, so that there was nothing talked of but this young and gallant slave, even by those who yet knew not that he was a prince. I ought to tell you that the Christians never buy any slaves but they give 'em some name of their own, their native ones being very likely very barbarous and hard to pronounce, so that Mr. Trefry gave Oroonoko that of Caesar, which name will live in that country as long as that, scarce more, glorious one of the great Roman, for 'tis most evident he wanted no part of the personal courage of that Caesar, and acted things as memorable, had they been done in some part of the world replenished with people and historians that might have given him his due. But his misfortune was to fall in an obscure world, that afforded only a female pen to celebrate his fame, though I doubt not but it had lived from others' endeavours if the Dutch, who immediately after his time took that country, had not killed, banished, and dispersed all those that were capable of giving the world this great man's life much better than I have done. and Mr. Trefry, who designed it, died before he began it, and bemoaned himself for not having undertook it in time. For the future, therefore, I must call Oroonoko Caesar, since by that name only he was known in our western world, and by that name he was received on shore at Parham House, where he was destined a slave. But if the king himself, God bless him, had come ashore, there could not have been greater expectation by all the whole plantation, and those neighbouring ones, than was on ours at that time, and he was received more like a governor than a slave. Notwithstanding, as the custom was, they assigned him his portion of land, his house, and his business up in the plantation. But as it was more for form than any design to put him to his task, he endured no more of the slave but the name, and remained some days in the house, receiving all visits that were made him, without stirring towards that part of the plantation where the negroes were. At last he would needs go view his land, his house, and the business assigned him. But he no sooner came to the houses of the slaves, which are like a little town by itself, the negroes having all left work, but they all came forth to behold him, and found he was that prince who had at several times sold most of 'em to these parts, and from a veneration they pay to great men, especially if they know 'em, and from the surprise and awe they had at the sight of him, they all cast themselves at his feet, crying out in their language, "Live, O king! Long live, O king!" and kissing his feet, paid him even divine homage. Several English gentlemen were with him, and what Mr. Trefry had told him was here confirmed, of which he himself before had no other witness than Caesar himself, but he was infinitely glad to find his grandeur confirmed by the adoration of all the slaves. Caesar, troubled with their over joy and over ceremony, besought him to rise, and to receive him as their fellow slave, assuring them he was no better. At which they set up with one accord a most terrible and hideous mourning and condoling, which he and the English had much ado to appease, but at last they prevailed with him, and they prepared all their barbarous music, and every one killed and dressed something of his own stock, for every family had their land apart, on which at their leisure times they breed all eatable things, and clubbing it together, made a most magnificent supper, inviting their grandee captain, their prince, to honour it with his presence, which he did, and several English with him, where they all waited on him, some playing, some dancing before him all the time, according to the manners of their several nations, and with unwearied industry endeavouring to please and delight him. While they sat at meat, Mr. Trefry told Caesar that most of these young slaves were undone in love with a fine she-slave, whom they had had about 6 months on their land. The prince, who never heard the name of love without a sigh, nor any mention of it without the curiosity of examining further into that tale, which of all discourses was most agreeable to him, asked how they came to be so unhappy as to be all undone for one fair slave. Trefry, who was naturally amorous, and loved to talk of love as well as anybody, proceeded to tell him they had the most charming black that ever was beheld on their plantation, about 15 or 16 years old, as he guessed, that for his part he had done nothing but sigh for her ever since she came, and that while all the white beauties he had seen never charmed him so absolutely as this fine creature had done, and that no man of any nation ever beheld her that did not fall in love with her, and that she had all the slaves perpetually at her feet, and that the whole country resounded with the fame of Clemeny. For so, said he, we have christened her, but she denies us all with such a noble disdain that 'tis a miracle to see that she who can give such eternal desires should herself be all ice and unconcern. She is adorned with the most graceful modesty that ever beautified youth, the softest sire, that, if she were capable of love, one would swear she languished for some absent happy man, and so retired as if she feared a rape even from the god of day, or that the breezes would steal kisses from her delicate mouth. Her task of work some sighing lover every day makes it his petition to perform for her, which she accepts blushing, and with reluctancy, for fear he will ask her a look for a recompense which he dares not presume to hope, so great an awe she strikes into the hearts of her admirers. I do not wonder, replied the prince, that Clemeny should refuse slaves, being, as you say, so beautiful, but wonder how she escapes those that can entertain her as you can do, or why, being your slave, you do not oblige her to yield. I confess, said Trefry, when I have, against her will, entertained her with love so long as to be transported with my passion even above decency, I have been ready to make use of those advantages of strength and